Adrian Wojnarowski here on the Rich Eisen Show. How are you, Adrian?
Rich, I'm great. Thanks for having me.
How big was this week for the Warriors, in your estimation, this past week?
Well, they've been really consistent as the season's gone on. I mean, they're going to lose once every three and a half weeks. They're at that pace going forward, and I think they've really starting to find their identity. They've been really, really good on the defensive end. I know everybody's talking about, as well they should, just the efficiency on offense. Kevin Durant scoring 40 points on 16 shots, which you mentioned in the intro. But defensively, they've really been good. You think back to that opening night game when the Spurs absolutely unloaded on them in Golden State. And I remember Draymond Green told me later in the year, that was the best thing that could have happened to us. And, you mentioned the teams. I think the Spurs are still the team. If there's a team in the West that can compete with them, it's the Spurs. But I think they set themselves so far. Initially, Klay Thompson was the player whose role they had to figure out. He was not getting – everyone was going to get less shots and less touches. And if you're not playing well, you're not shooting well on a given night, you don't have more opportunities to get into a rhythm when there's less to go around. But they knew what they were taking on with Kevin Durant, and they were all, to a man, enthusiastic about doing it. Steph Curry, Draymond Green, Klay Thompson. Their key guys knew that their numbers were going to go down. Their offense individually was going to go down, and people have talked a lot about, well, what's wrong with Steph Curry this year? And I do think that Steve Kerr made a pretty good analogy when he said, hey, Ted Williams hit 406 in the season. The next year when he hits 380, there was nothing wrong with Ted Williams. What Curry did last year was you're not going to keep that up, and he wasn't going to keep that up. And I think now you're seeing the one thing that I've liked about Durant is I think when you've seen stretches where other players, whether it was Curry or Klay Thompson, were maybe fading from the forefront offensively, he's made sure to get them to do his part to get them involved. Durant hasn't come in there and said, hey, this has got to be about me now, and I want to. Is he their most dominant offensive player now? Yes, he is. But at the same time, I think he's very cognizant of how he fits in with that group. And I don't think that team's built to have that kind of internal turmoil. They were all on board with bringing him in, and I think they all took ownership of that. And I think that makes a difference. This wasn't something management just stuck on them and said, hey, we're bringing him in. Tough for anybody who doesn't like it here. They didn't do it that way. And if those players had said, we don't want Durant, I don't think they would have went after him.
Adrian Wojnarowski joining me here on the Rich Eisen Show. Saturday was an interesting day for Greg Popovich. Prior to the game, he went off on Donald Trump in a way that certainly made headlines, to say the least. Then his Spurs go out and beat the Cavs in overtime in Cleveland. Just tell me something about Popovich that some folks may not know, how comfortable he is in his role, and I guess where he must be in his mind to be able to talk about so many issues that have nothing to do with basketball that may rub some of the Spurs fan base the wrong way. Adrian.
Yeah, he's in a unique position job-wise. And I talked about this with other coaches in the league, and David Fizdale in Memphis, we talked about Steve Kerr and Greg Popovich, Stan Van Gundy, and just other coaches in the NBA who have spoken up on political issues, on social issues, more so than any other sport. I think it has to do with, number one, coaches generally in a pretty comfortable place. It's harder for David Fizdale to do it as a first-year head coach than it is for Stan Van Gundy, who has complete control in Detroit, or obviously Popovich, who's won 5 titles, who's untouchable. And also remember this about Greg Popovich. He is a military academy graduate. He went to the Air Force Academy, majored in Russian studies, ironically enough, and spent time undercover at different times in Russia, which he will never talk about. He's never spoken publicly about it anyway. He comes in, and now he's the national team coach. He comes with a lot of credibility, and he's not afraid of whatever criticism comes on it. There's no question. And I do think the NBA has been different. I don't think you're going to see this in football. I don't think you're going to see it in baseball. I think the NBA is unique in that way. Some people don't like it, but There's certainly voices in the NBA. I think Adam Silver is, whether owners like it or not, there are probably more owners who voted for Donald Trump than there aren't, than didn't. But I think certainly coaches have the support of Silver on it. And again, this is like, you're allowed to say what you want. Commissioner can't come down on you. You know, an owner may have an issue with it, but at the same time, most of the coaches who've spoken up are in the kinds of position where there probably isn't going to be brushback. And if there is, I think those guys can live with it. Adrian
Wojnarowski of Yahoo Sports joining me here on the Rich Eisen Show. A couple weeks ago, Adrian, I said, you know what, if Phil Jackson is really using a writer who he's known for years, a former coach for them at the old Albany Patroons, to try and get Carmelo Anthony out of town, he should just walk through the front door and say to him, "We want you out of here." And then they had a meeting, and apparently it was businesslike. I read your stuff all the time. Is Carmelo going to be forced out of town? Will he just eventually just say, "Uncle," and get me out of here? How's this all going to play out, Adrian?
Is it possible eventually he changes his mind on the no trade clause? It is. But I do think there's a big part. In fact, I know there's a big part of Carmelo who doesn't want to feel like he let Phil Jackson run him out of town. That there's a part of Carmelo that would like to outlast Phil Jackson in New York. Their contracts are actually on pretty comparable planes right now. Listen, at some point, he's got an opt-out in 18-19 where he could become a free agent. The number that year, his salary that year, I want to say is, I don't have it in front of me, I want to say it's 25 to 27 million, maybe it's even a little bit more. You know, would he opt out of that? Would he opt in? And then I don't know. But I think for Carmelo, he's never talked about, I want to leave and go chase the ring somewhere else. He has liked playing it. He loves playing in New York. Mm-hmm. He likes living in New York. His wife likes being in New York. He's not rich. Anything can change in sports. Anything, his perspective on it could change. It is hard to do a trade for him because of his salary. What teams would have to give up, what the Knicks would get. It would be interesting to see what would be available out there to them and where he'd want to play. I know people talk about Cleveland. He makes too much money to go to the Cavs, and he is close with LeBron. His contract doesn't fit into their, even in a trade, I don't know what the pieces would be to make it work. And I don't think Carmelo wants to play in Cleveland. I think, would it be a big city possible, in LA? Yes, I think that if he does leave, that would appeal to him. But I think he's been very adamant here. He told it to Phil Jackson's face in the meeting last week, and he certainly shared it privately with people that he wants to stay for now, and he certainly doesn't want he doesn't want the perception that he let Phil run him out of town.
So what big names? Last one for you. Are we going to hear over the next few weeks before the trade deadline? Woj, what names?
Well, I don't know that there's going to be a like a superstar player that moves on the market. I think Boston continues to try to get at whether it's a Jimmy Butler or Paul George, but those players aren't available. Those teams aren't trading now. DeMarcus Cousins has not been available. Teams feel like with the new salary cap structure, they can convince players now with a new collective bargaining agreement that they can pay someone so much more to stay where they are than to leave. They're not in a rush to just give these guys up for 50 cents on the dollar. I think there may be an active trade deadline, but I don't think it's going to include a lot of big names. Rudy Gay was the one name I was fairly certain, or most were fairly certain, would get traded, and now he's out for the season, so that won't happen.
Woj, thanks for the time, man. Again, love your stuff.
Thanks, Rich. I appreciate it.
Always at Woj Vertical NBA.
The Rich Eisen Show, weekdays at noon Eastern on Audience.